It happened in the fall of 2019 when I was driving home late at night through a rural stretch of road outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. The highway was empty, nothing but miles of open desert and the occasional flicker of headlights from a distant car. I'd been on the road for hours, exhausted but determined to push through, when I saw the glow of red and blue lights flashing in my rearview mirror. A police car. Relieved that it was nothing serious, probably just a routine stop, I pulled over to the side of the road and waited, my hands on the wheel. The cruiser behind me kept its headlights on, bright and blinding, making it impossible to see the officer approach. A silhouette moved toward my window, slow and deliberate, until I could just make out the shape of a tall, broad figure in uniform. I rolled down my window, trying to stay calm as I greeted him. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he just stood there, unmoving. I glanced up, my stomach twisting when I realized I couldn't see his face. His hat cast a shadow over it, and the angle of the headlights made his features impossible to make out. He finally spoke. His voice was flat, almost mechanical, as he asked where I was headed. I answered quickly, explaining I was just passing through on my way home. He didn't respond immediately, just stood there, breathing slow and deep. Something about it felt off. I couldn't hear any radio chatter, no background noise, just silence. Then he asked for my license and registration. I reached over to my glove compartment, pulled them out and handed them over. His fingers brushed against mine and they were ice cold. Not normal, not just cool from the night air, freezing. My skin burned from the brief contact. A deep sense of unease settled in my gut. I watched as he took the documents and turned, walking back toward his car without another word. The red and blue lights continued to flash, painting the inside of my car in rhythmic waves of color. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. I turned my head slightly, trying to see what he was doing in the cruiser, but the headlights were too bright. My heart pounded as I realized I couldn't hear a single sound. No rustling of paper, no radio chatter, no movement, just silence. Something was wrong. I hesitated, then slowly pushed my door open, stepping out into the cold night air. The wind had picked up, sending loose gravel skittering across the asphalt. The police car was still there, but as I walked toward it, something felt wrong. The closer I got, the heavier the air became, pressing down on me like a weight. I reached the rear of my car and stopped. My breath hitched. The driver's seat of the police cruiser was empty. The engine was running, the red and blue lights still flashing, but there was no one inside. The documents I had handed over were sitting on the dashboard, untouched. I took a step back, my pulse hammering. I turned, scanning the area, expecting to see the officer somewhere in the darkness. Nothing, just the endless stretch of road and the whisper of the wind through the desert. That's when I heard it, a tap, soft, deliberate, coming from inside my own car. I turned slowly, dread sinking into my bones. Through the windshield, I saw the faint outline of a figure sitting in my back seat. The shape was dark, blurred, as if it wasn't fully there. My entire body went cold. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The door locks clicked, not unlocking, locking. The thing in the back seat moved. I didn't think. I ran, sprinting down the highway, not stopping to look back, not stopping for anything. My lungs burned, my legs felt weak, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I don't know how long I ran before I saw headlights approaching from the opposite direction. A real police car pulled up and an actual officer stepped out, confused and concerned. I barely managed to explain what had happened between gasping breaths. He walked over to my car cautiously, flashlight in hand, and pulled the door open. Nothing was there. No figure, no sign of forced entry, just my documents still resting on the passenger seat where I had left them. The police cruiser that had stopped me, nowhere to be found. The officer checked his radio, frowning as he told me something that made my blood run cold. There had been no other patrol cars on duty in the area that night. I never found out who or what pulled me over that night, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't human. It happened in the spring of 2023 when I was working the night shift as a 911 dispatcher in a small town in upstate New York. It wasn't a job I had planned on, but after some training I settled into the routine. Most nights were quiet, the occasional domestic dispute or stranded driver, but nothing like what I was about to experience. That night started like any other, sipping coffee, staring at the dull glow of my monitors, waiting for calls that rarely came. Then, at exactly 2:13 a.m., the phone rang. I answered, expecting the usual static or a pocket dial. Instead, there was silence. Not just someone hesitating, deep silence, unnatural, like the line had been swallowed by something. I repeated my standard response, asking if anyone was there, but there was no answer. Just a faint crackling noise, like an old recording struggling to play. Then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard breathing. Slow, shallow, deliberate. Someone was there. I leaned in closer, lowering my voice. I asked if they needed help. The breathing stopped. A long pause stretched between us, so heavy it made my skin crawl. Then, very softly, a voice whispered something that sent a chill down my spine. It was distant, distorted, but I could just make out the words. "He's here." My body went rigid. I asked who was there, if they were in danger, but the voice didn't respond. The breathing started again, this time faster, more panicked. Then a second voice came through, deeper, closer, not whispering, laughing, low, guttural, like someone barely restraining themselves from speaking. The line cut off. I sat there, my pulse pounding in my ears. I traced the call, hoping it would be some prank, some bored teenager messing around. But the location sent a wave of nausea through me. The call had come from an abandoned house just outside town, a place I knew well because it had been empty for decades. I hesitated before calling it in, but something in my gut told me this wasn't a hoax. I relayed the details to the nearest patrol car, explaining the situation as best as I could. The officer on duty, his name was Garrett, sighed and said he'd check it out. I stayed on the line with him as he drove, my nails digging into my palms. When he arrived, I heard him shift in his seat, muttering under his breath. He confirmed that the house was still boarded up, just like it had been for years. No signs of forced entry, no lights inside, just an old, decaying structure that no one had any business being near at this hour. Still, he got out, flashlight in hand, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots echoing through my headset. He moved toward the house, and for a while everything was quiet. I listened to his breathing, steady and controlled, as he checked the perimeter. Then, without warning, his breathing hitched. He whispered something that sent ice through my veins. The front door was open. I checked the reports again. That house had been sealed shut years ago. No trespassing signs everywhere, no reason for anyone to go inside. But Garrett swore the door was slightly ajar. The wooden boards meant to keep people out splintered, like something had forced its way in. He stepped inside, his voice low as he described what he saw. Dust-covered floors, peeling wallpaper, furniture that hadn't been touched in years, and then he stopped. I could hear his breath quicken, hear the shift of his boots against the wood. He whispered into the radio, his voice tight. Some character, "There's a phone on the table." I sat up straight. That was impossible. The power had been shut off years ago, no one lived there, and yet someone had placed an old rotary phone in the middle of the room. Garrett described it as dusty, the cord cut, completely disconnected. But the receiver was off the hook. My stomach twisted, the call, the breathing, the whisper, the laughter. It had come from this phone. Before I could process what was happening, a loud crash echoed through the radio. Garrett swore, his breathing turning ragged as he fumbled to respond. He said something had fallen. A piece of the ceiling, maybe, but I could hear it in his voice. He wasn't sure if he was alone anymore. Then came the sound I will never forget. A sharp, high-pitched click, like a phone being put back on the hook. I froze. Garrett's breath hitched, and then, in the distance, a voice spoke. Not through the radio, not from Garrett, from inside the house. A slow, distorted whisper. Some character. "He's here." Garrett ran. I could hear the heavy slam of the front door, the crunch of his boots against the gravel as he rushed back to his car. His breathing was frantic, his voice barely steady as he told me he was leaving, that there was something wrong with that house. The last thing he said before cutting the call was a question I never answered. Some character, "Did you hear it too?" The house was searched the next day, but nothing was found. No footprints, no evidence of a break-in, no sign that anyone had been there at all. But the phone, the old disconnected phone, was gone. I quit the job a month later. I never told anyone what happened, never tried to find out who or what made that call. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up to the sound of my phone ringing. When I answer, there's nothing but breathing. It happened in the summer of 23 when I was working as a rookie officer in a small-town police station in West Virginia. The station itself was old, a leftover from the early 1900s, with creaky floors and cells that hadn't been used in years. Most nights were uneventful, just patrolling quiet streets and handling the occasional drunk causing trouble. But one night I learned that some places, no matter how quiet, hold things that should be left alone. That night, a storm rolled in, thick clouds swallowing the moon, rain hammering the windows. It was just me and another officer, Dawson, covering the night shift. It happened in the spring of 2024 when I was working as a rookie officer in a small-town police station in West Virginia. The station itself was old, a leftover from the early 1900s with creaky floors and cells that hadn't been used in years. Most nights were uneventful, just patrolling quiet streets and handling the occasional drunk causing trouble. But one night I learned that some places, no matter how quiet, hold things that should be left alone. That night a storm rolled in, thick clouds swallowing the moon, rain hammering the windows. It was just me and another officer, Dawson, covering the night shift. Around 2 a.m., we got a call about a man loitering near an abandoned building just outside town. The caller said he was just standing there, staring at the streetlight, not moving. They said something about him didn't seem right. We drove out expecting to find a drunk or a lost traveler, but when we arrived, he was still there. He stood completely still under the dim glow of the flickering street lamp, his back to us. He wore an old suit, torn and dirty, his posture rigid. The way he stood, it was wrong. Dawson called out to him, but he didn't respond. He didn't turn, didn't even flinch. I approached cautiously, the hairs on my arms standing on end. As I got closer, I realized something chilling. He wasn't wet. The rain had been pouring for an hour, soaking everything, and yet his clothes were bone dry. I reached out, hesitating before touching his shoulder. The second my fingers brushed against him, his head snapped to the side. Not turned, snapped, like something had yanked it unnaturally. His eyes, completely black. No whites, no pupils, just a void. And then he smiled. Not a normal smile, but something wider than it should have been. Unnatural, stretched. My stomach twisted, every instinct screaming at me to back away. Dawson moved in quickly, grabbing his arm, but the second he touched him, the man collapsed. Not like a person fainting, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. His body hit the ground, limp and lifeless. We checked for a pulse. Nothing. He was dead. We radioed it in and transported the body back to the station until the coroner could arrive in the morning. The storm had knocked out the power in parts of town, so there was no place else to hold him. We locked him in one of the old cells in the back, the ones barely used anymore, and tried to shake the unsettling feeling that something was wrong. By 4 a.m. the station was quiet. I sat at my desk trying to write up the report, but I couldn't focus. Every time I looked toward the hallway leading to the cells, a deep unease crawled over me. Something felt off. The air was too still. Then I heard it, a soft, scraping sound. I turned toward the hallway, my pulse quickening. It was coming from the back, from the cells. Dawson was in the other room, half asleep, so I grabbed my flashlight and moved cautiously down the hall. The station was eerily silent except for that slow, dragging sound. I reached the holding cell. My breath caught in my throat. The body was sitting up. My hand tightened around my flashlight. I knew what I was seeing wasn't possible. The man had been dead. No pulse, no breath. But now he was sitting upright, his back facing me, shoulders rising and falling as if he were breathing. I called out to Dawson, my voice barely steady, but before he could respond, the man moved. He stood, slowly, his spine cracking with every inch he straightened. His arms hung limply at his sides, head tilting unnaturally. I stepped back, reaching for my gun, but something stopped me. A sound, a laugh, low, guttural, echoing from deep within his chest. It wasn't human, it wasn't right. Then he turned around. His mouth was open, wider than a person's should be, stretching past the limits of bone and muscle. His black eyes locked onto mine, and I felt it, something staring back at me from inside him. The lights flickered. The room seemed to stretch, warp, pull toward him. I stumbled backward, my vision tunneling, my ears ringing. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The power snapped back, the lights steady. Dawson rushed in, gun drawn, demanding to know what was happening. But the cell was empty. The body was gone. The door was still locked. No way in, no way out. But he wasn't there. We searched the entire station. Nothing. No trace of him. The security footage cut out for exactly 7 minutes, the time I had been in the hallway. The next morning, when the coroner arrived, we told him the body had disappeared. He gave us a strange look before shaking his head and handing me a file. The man had died 3 days ago. His body had already been collected and buried. But we saw him. We had him. To this day, I don't know what we locked in that cell. I don't know where it went, but sometimes late at night when I'm alone at the station, I hear it again, a soft scraping sound, coming from the empty cell at the end of the hall. Some things can't be explained. A routine stop that leads to something inhuman, a call from a place that should be empty, a body that disappears without a trace. Police reports don't tell the whole story because some cases aren't meant to be solved. If these stories gave you chills, like, share and subscribe for more terrifying true horror stories. And don't forget to hit the bell icon, because the scariest things happen when no one is watching. Stay safe. And if you ever hear a knock from inside an empty cell, don't open the door.